Hello, beautiful community. I'm not an expert in international development, but I want to comment really in my capacity as a political philosopher and just as Vlad, somebody you bring into your living rooms, on Trump freezing USaid for 90 days. And as you know, USaid is the biggest funder of aid programs all over the world. And the word freeze is in a way wrong, because if you're talking about oxygen tanks, medications, immunizations, you're really talking about a pause on somebody's access to a life jacket when they're out at sea, if you like. You can call it a pause, but it's also a shutdown, because if you give it back to them 10 minutes later, that 10 minutes may have already put them in so much strife that they're not going to be okay at the end. And so we're talking about huge impact, and we're talking about huge soft power for the United States. But I don't want to talk about it in the way that you would see it being talked about everywhere. I want to bring in a different angle. And that's that leaders of organizations, charity organizations that have an affiliation or have a counterpart in the US are feeling quite frozen and speaking carefully and self-censoring and silencing. And that's a very powerful phenomenon. So what have you got there, right? And this is very much stuff that I'm hearing from folks working in that field. What you've got there is a situation of powerful people who are doing really important work with good intentions, freezing in fear of a more powerful person on whom they are dependent and who is vindictive, petty, and unpredictable. And of course, you can expand this. The same stuff works with journalists. We're talking about a kind of chill. And I think I'm going to make a main channel video about this, right? The chilling effect of Trump. And the phenomena you've got here is the phenomena of co-option. You very often talk about bad patterns in politics corrupting people. But while that happens, an even more powerful effect is the effect of co-option, because this kind of well-intentioned, understandable, right, freeze, self-censoring freeze, not the freeze on USAID, normalizes the reckless power exercise, which then leads to you needing to freeze and self-censor more, which then normalizes the reckless power exercise more. And so that's a pattern of co-option that we're going to see across the board. And I'm just giving you the example from this USAID scenario. And there is a second element here, and that is, of course, the self-perpetuating nature of a lot of the democratic decline we're seeing, because understanding how society works is not physics, right? There are no generalizable, transparent laws you can concoct about this that are going to be valid. But nevertheless, you can see tendencies and you can see patterns, right? And it's for the reason of this being one of 77 self-perpetuating patterns of democratic decline that we can sit here fairly confidently, I'm afraid, and say that the chances are that on balance, most Western democracies will be quite a bit weaker 10 years from now than they are today. And you come out of all the words I've just briefly put on the table with a sense of the importance of boldness in moments like this. The boldness to not freak out and not exaggerate, but to call a spade a spade. And what you're increasingly going to see is a lot of people, sometimes with bad intentions, but a lot of people with good intentions doing good things, increasingly not calling a spade, thereby normalizing, right, things floating around labeled spades that aren't spades at all. Sorry. Normalizing things going round that are spades that are labeled as not being spades and being something different. So that's really what I wanted to share, but perhaps there are two background lessons here for us too. The first lesson is we've got to take seriously that this kind of conversation isn't a reason to freak out about Trump. Trump isn't the cause of this fundamentally. He's a symptom of patterns of democratic decline, right? So what you've got to understand is that it's the extraordinary collapse of center-left and center-right politics, the failures of technocratic centrism, right, that explain why Trump won. That's much more like the cause, right, than Trump. If Trump had lost, US democratic decline would have accelerated at a slower pace, right? If Trump had won but been a much more competent authoritarian than he is, then perhaps US democratic decline would have accelerated at a faster pace than it would accelerate under Trump. And now one final remark. There is going to be a tendency in the pro-Ukrainian internet to isolate Trump on Ukraine, if he ends up not being too bad on Ukraine, from Trump on other things. There's going to be algorithmic incentives to do that. And it's very important to be aware and resistant of this, also to be compassionate toward people in this space trying to do their best and advocate for Ukraine. But what you don't want to do is see somebody driving a boat through a reef with the engine scraping on the reef and ignore that and start praising them for, giving out sunscreen to everybody on the boat very effectively. Well, the problem is that the engine might not break down, but it's accumulating damage, and that's in the medium term going to hurt the very people who got sunscreen on the boat. So you can't separate, right, Trump doing quite a bit to break down whatever is left of the largely collapsed international order, picking verbal fights with allies. You can't separate that from the Ukrainian lane because it's all connected. And quite frankly, everything that is going on about Ukraine, right, that emanates out of US foreign policy, is a product of these larger domestic and global forces. I wanted to give that warning too. Lots of love. Talk very soon.